this letter to Wallace. Korngold and his wife were still in Hollywood. They got news that the Chancellor of Austria had just met with Hitler to begin the Anschluss. It's the peaceful annexation of Austria to the Nazis.
Yeah.
So it was the Nazis taking over Austria.
Yeah.
So he found out that was happening the day after. Korngold was Jewish. His son was still in Austria. And so they sent word to him to immediately leave Austria, come to Hollywood, because Korngold had decided, even though he did not think he could compose the score for this film, for his son to come to Hollywood because he was going to compose the score for the adventures of Robin Hood. And his son left the day before Hitler closed all of the borders to Austria. So he wouldn't have been able to get out. But the interesting thing is, tying it in to last week's episode, do you know who was also on the train out of Austria at that exact same moment, the day before the borders were closed?
The Von Trapps.
The Von Trapp family singers. So I just thought that was fascinating that the Von Trapp family singers left at this very same day that Erich Wolfgang Korngold's son left.
Yeah.
All because of Hitler.
That's cool. Wow.
Yeah, but anyway, because Korngold was Jewish, his house and his belongings were seized by the Nazis, and they said, well, it's because of your debt. And Korngold said, he later claimed that Robin Hood saved my life. We thought ourselves Viennese, but Hitler made us Jewish. Like I said, if you haven't listened to Korngold's amazing score, and he wrote many, many amazing film scores for Warner Brothers films throughout the late 30s. Throughout the late 30s and World War II. Film historian Tony Thomas said of Korngold's score, it's practically an opera minus a libretto, and as a textbook example of what music can do for a film. He made an art form of the film score by weaving the music throughout the picture to enhance the rich visuals with equally descriptive notes and creating musical character themes. It was actually slated for, I think, a February 1938 release, but they extended it because it went over budget. It took Korngold so long to write the score. Mm-hmm. According to his son, he had many problems writing this score. He was always kind of in turmoil trying to write it. And then there was a $100,000 budget for advertising, which was the most money that Warner Brothers had ever put down for advertising on any film. But it worked because it doubled its production budget. I think it even more than doubled. It cost $2 million to make and made over twice that at the box office. And then at the 11th Academy Awards, it was nominated for Best Picture, Best Art Direction, Best Film Editing, and Best Original Score for Korngold. It won all except for the most envied Best Picture, which would have been accepted by Hal B. Wallis. But Wallace won the Irving Thalberg Memorial Award that year for consistent high quality of motion picture production. Irving Thalberg had been the head of production at MGM and was Louis B. Mayer's right-hand man, but he died. I can't remember if it was a heart attack. It was some illness that he died from in 1936, and then Louis B. Mayer took over head of production at the studio until 1943 when he hired Dory Sherry, and then abruptly fired him. Anyway, another story, but that's the Irving Thalberg Award, which I don't even think they have anymore.
Yeah, I haven't heard of it, so...
There's the Cecil B. DeMille Award at the Golden Globes. Olivier de Havilland did not see the picture until 1959 in Paris because, like all contract stars, they cranked out so many films and were constantly so exhausted, they never had the time to go to the premieres and actually watch the films. So she did not see the film until 1959 in Paris, and she said she was struck by how good it was, and she wrote a letter to Errol Flynn telling him how impressed she was and how dismissive she had been of it. An apology 20 years late, she later recalled, but I tore it up. I reconsidered, deciding Errol would think I was silly. I'll always be sorry. A few months later, he was dead. He died from a heart attack in 1959. Yeah. Seeing Robin Hood after all these years made me realize, Olivier de Havilland realized how good all our adventure films were, and I wrote Errol that I was glad I had been in every scene of them. I was astounded at Robin Hood's vitality, its effervescence. I thought it was simply wonderful. It was a revelation to me. It was classic. Wow. And that is the history of the making of Robin Hood. Now, do you want to hear about the history of Technicolor?
Yeah, I mean...
Okay. Thoughts on, like, the history... You're about to fall asleep, but do you have any thoughts on the history of the making of Robin Hood?
That's cool. It's like... What strikes me is just the moment that it was, like... kind of some things hanging in the balance, and just with the film industry and things like that, and how it definitely launched some careers, but it just kind of very much a product of the moment. And it's always cool
Right.
to see when those kind of projects have staying power. And like I think that's really cool, and that praise by Olivia de Havilland is high praise, and that's cool to that is so interesting that she didn't watch it until 20 years later. That's really cool.
And the reaction she had to it. You need to. There was an interview I watched last night with Olivia de Havilland talking about Errol Flynn, and she talked about like Jimmy Stewart and other stars. She died, I think, last year at 104 years old.
Yeah,
She
I saw
lived
that.
forever.
She kicked for a long time.
She did. One of the interviews she gave, she was talking about each of the male stars that she had been with. Like, she thought at one time she was going to marry Howard Hughes. That didn't work out. She was going to marry Jimmy Stewart. That didn't work out. And she was, kind of being silly. But she started talking about Errol Flynn, and she started crying. And she was, so upset. She said he died way too early, and she cried and cried because she felt that he was possibly the love of her life. But go watch any interview with Olivia de Havilland, because you can tell how incredibly intelligent she is.
Yeah.
Well, and I mean, any of our listeners, you don't have to, Garrett, but any of our listeners.
I will. I mean, that's really cool. Yeah, and any listeners, check them out.
Well, and we need to talk about later, like the de Havilland Law, what that meant in 1943, and how she almost got blackballed by the studio system for implementing the de Havilland Law, which kind of implemented the fact that studios could not control their contract stars as much as they had in the past. But real fast, the history of three-strip Technicolor. So like I said, Jack Warner was very interested in making every technological advancement he could in each of his films, like with Al Jolson in The Jazz Singer. And then he signed a contract with the Technicolor company in the early 30s, and he had to make several different films, like 4 films and 2-strip Technicolor. Mm-hmm. So what Technicolor was there was a man named Herbert Kalmus, and I believe he was some sort of professor of something at some university, but I cannot remember what it was in the documentary. Hollywood only had black and white film. Everybody only had black and white film. He was convinced that he could produce some sort of color film. So he and his wife, Natalie Kalmus, well, really, it was he who developed it. He developed a color system that was used somewhat in Hollywood in the mid to late 1920s and early 1930s that was known as 2-strip Technicolor. And it's an additive color system. If you remember from our lighting class in our theater school, Garrett, what it is there was a camera that shot 2 strips of black and white film. Mm-hmm. One was exposed to a red lens, one was exposed to a green lens, and then they were dyed in their complementary colors, which were these very toxic dyes. And then originally, those 2-strip Technicolor prints were like held together with quick dry cement, which caused all sorts of problems with the projector. So Hollywood studios didn't exactly like that, because it was like ruining film projectors in their movie theaters. Yeah. So then he developed a system shortly after that where he could transpose both strips of film to one strip of film, which still, because it was only red and green film, 2 strips that had been exposed to red and green, you did not have all of the colors of the rainbow yet. There were certain different weird colorings that went on. Yeah. And anybody who's watched Scorsese's Aviator knows the first half of Aviator is shot. It's digitally manipulated to look like 2-strip Technicolor because that was the color process that they had at the time. Mm-hmm. So everybody who watches the film and complains of the grass being blue on the golf course where Cate Blanchett and Leonardo DiCaprio are playing golf, the green grass would have come across blue in 2-strip Technicolor. Yeah. Critics did not like it. Audiences didn't like it because the colors just looked strange. But then Herbert Kalmus, I believe he announced in the early 1930s that he now has a color system that can produce all of the colors of the rainbow. And Hollywood at this point, shooting a film in black and white had become a sort of an art form. Mm-hmm. They could make things look really, really beautiful in black and white. But they went big whoop when he said, well, now I have a color process that can capture all of the colors of the rainbow. Wow. And so they all said big whoop. And so then he went to the one person that was still trying to catch on to the big studio system. Mm-hmm. In 1932. He went to Walt Disney. And he said, why don't you try to use my color system in some of your cartoons? And Walt Disney was like, we looked into 2-strip Technicolor. We did not like it. And Herbert Kalmus said, well, why don't you let me shoot you outside in front of your office in 3-strip Technicolor and see how you like it? So Herbert Kalmus shot him in 3-strip Technicolor. They had the film, They had the film developed. Then they sent it to Walt Disney. Walt Disney watched it and he was like, this is absolutely amazing. How can we use this on our cartoons? So then in 1932, Walt Disney used it on a short Technicolor, or a short cartoon called Flowers and Trees, and it slowly picked up, slowly but surely, until RKO used it in 1934 for a feature film musical comedy called La Cucaracha. And then in 1935, there was a film studio called Pioneer Studios. They made a melodrama with Miriam Hopkins, who was one of the biggest stars in the 1930s, called Becky Sharp. Obviously, the cinematographer did not know what he was doing, because 3-strip Technicolor produces all of the colors on the rainbow it's like a saturation that is much higher than regular colors. And so all of the critics, everyone who saw it, said that all of the people in the film looked like they were jaundiced. The colors were too bright. They didn't like how it looked. But still, then Universal produced one film in 1936 called Trail of the Lonesome Pines in Technicolor. People were like, it was all shot outdoors. It's Sylvia Sidney and Fred McMurray, and they were like, this Technicolor footage of the outdoor mountain scenery actually looks gorgeous. Jack Warner used it in 1937 for a film called God's Country and the Woman, and that got good reviews. Mm-hmm. And so then he tried to use it again for Adventures of Robin Hood. And critics and audiences were still skeptical about it until 1939, when David O. Selznick used it on Gone with the Wind. Mm-hmm. And MGM used it on Wizard of Oz, and then all of a sudden everybody was all in on Technicolor.
Yeah.
Because they made it look gorgeous.
Yeah, those are pretty good movies, color-wise.
Oh, yes.
They really make an effort to show what it can do, for sure.
Oh, for sure. And even Robin Hood, but it was almost like it took a little bit, like, for the technicians and the crew to catch on, and the designers even to be like, oh, this is what it's going to look like in 3-strip Technicolor.
I think I just, when I think of it, like, how it must have looked, and I wish I could have experienced this, but like the Wizard of Oz, because I obviously Gone with the Wind is great as well, color-wise, but the Wizard of Oz, the way they frame it, of having the sepia tone black and white,
right,
and then going into the magnificent colors, like seeing that in a movie theater, just being like, oh,
I know.
You know?
Well, and that's part of it. I need to explain exactly how 3-strip Technicolor works in just a second, but Warner Archive, especially, and Warner Brothers, because Technicolor, 3-strip Technicolor, is 3 strips of 35 millimeter black and white film that have been dyed in different colors to get that very bright, vibrant look. But what they will do is they will take those 3 strips of Technicolor film, the original camera negatives, and they will scan them at 4K and then digitally realign them. So then you get, if you buy the Blu-rays, don't stream them, buy the Blu-rays, watch them on a big screen, you get an image that is very, very similar to what the original Technicolor picture looks like. Warner Brothers last year or 2 years ago put out a 4K Blu-ray of Wizard of Oz, and that is a 4K scan of the original nitrate Technicolor camera negatives. So that looks ridiculous, like the original Technicolor.
Yeah.
And then The Red Shoes, which was a 1948 kind of semi-musical Technicolor film from a production company called The Archers in Great Britain, and they look gorgeous. And Warner Archive is doing a fantastic job of like taking these 3 strips of Technicolor film, scanning them at 4K, and then realigning them with this process that they invented themselves through Warner Brothers Motion Picture Imaging, and then, remastering them for Blu-ray, and they look absolutely gorgeous. But how 3-strip Technicolor worked was they were these giant film cameras that were owned by Technicolor. I think there were only 24 of them. And the process and the cameras were owned by Technicolor. So if studios were going to use the Technicolor process, they had to rent them out. And that's one reason that a lot of films were shot in black and white in 1939, because David O. Selznick had rented out all of the Technicolor cameras for a very long period of time to shoot Gone with the Wind. Like Marie Antoinette was supposed to be shot in Technicolor. Pride and Prejudice with Greer Garson and Laurence Olivier was supposed to be shot in Technicolor. And they were designed for Technicolor. But they were these massive cameras that would shoot 3 strips of black and white film simultaneously. They were made out of nitrate, which is what is used as gunpowder. It's explosive. And they stopped making film on nitrate in 1953 because these film prints would get so hot that they would explode on the studio lots. Another story for another day. They would shoot these 3